The crystal wine glass slipped from Margaret Thornton's manicured fingers, shattering against the imported Italian marble as she stared at her phone screen in complete shock. The Forbes notification glowed brightly: America's hidden heiresses. The billionaire daughters living in secret. And there, in the third photograph, was her despised daughter-in-law, Julianne, sitting in a boardroom worth more than the entire Thornton family estate. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. For 4 excruciating years, Margaret had endured what she considered the greatest humiliation of her social standing life. Her eldest son, Preston, heir to the modest Thornton construction fortune, had married what she was convinced was nothing more than an opportunistic waitress from the wrong side of Denver. Tonight, staring at that Forbes article, Margaret realized she had been calling a woman worth $3 billion a gold digger. The irony was so devastating it made her physically ill, but this story begins much earlier, in a completely different world than the one Margaret thought she knew. Julianne Martinez had grown up in a universe where money wasn't discussed because there was simply too much of it to comprehend. Her father, Diego Martinez, had built an empire that started with a single food truck in East Los Angeles and evolved into the largest restaurant conglomerate in North America. By the time Julianne was born, Martinez Holdings owned everything from fast casual chains to Michelin-starred establishments across 4 continents. The Martinez family compound in Malibu stretched across 47 acres of prime oceanfront property. Julianne's childhood bedroom overlooked the Pacific, with floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's houses. She had attended exclusive Swiss boarding schools, spent summers in the family's Tuscan villa, and learned to pilot helicopters before she could legally drive a car. Her coming-of-age party had been featured in Architectural Digest, not because they sought publicity, but because the event planner had convinced her parents that the floral arrangements alone represented a new level of artistic achievement. Yet, by her 22nd birthday, Julianne felt suffocated by the golden cage of her inheritance. Every friendship felt transactional. Every romantic interest seemed calculated. She had watched 3 different boyfriends Google her net worth during dinner dates, their attitudes shifting visibly once they understood the magnitude of her family's wealth. The last one, a Harvard business student named Bradley, had actually presented her with a detailed business proposal disguised as a marriage proposal, complete with projections of how their combined assets could dominate the hospitality market. That night, alone in her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Julianne made a decision that would define the next chapter of her life. She was going to disappear. The transformation took 6 months of meticulous planning. Working with a discreet attorney who specialized in privacy protection for high-net-worth individuals, Julianne legally changed her surname from Martinez to her maternal grandmother's maiden name, Roberts. She studied the art of blending in, practicing everything from changing her accent to understanding the intricacies of budget shopping. Most importantly, she learned to suppress the unconscious behaviors that marked someone who had never worried about money. No more automatically choosing the most expensive menu item. No more casually mentioning trips to private islands or art auctions. Denver seemed like the perfect place for reinvention. Far enough from the coastal elite circles where the Martinez name carried weight, but cosmopolitan enough that a young woman could build a life without attracting too much attention. Julianne found a modest studio apartment in the Highland neighborhood, furnished it with carefully chosen second-hand pieces, and got a job waitressing at Rustic Table, a popular farm-to-table restaurant downtown. The work was harder than anything she had ever experienced, but it was also liberating. For the first time in her life, her value was determined entirely by her performance. Regular customers appreciated her attention to detail and genuine warmth. Her coworkers respected her work ethic. Her manager, Carlos, praised her ability to handle difficult situations with grace. None of them knew that she had once dined at restaurants where a single meal cost more than their monthly rent. Julianne discovered she actually enjoyed the rhythm of service, the satisfaction of turning tables efficiently, the small victories of making someone's day better with exceptional hospitality. When she received her first paycheck, she felt a pride that none of her trust fund distributions had ever provided. She was earning her own way, proving to herself that she had value beyond her family name and inheritance. The apartment she rented for $800 a month was smaller than the walk-in closet in her Malibu bedroom, but it felt more like home than anywhere she had ever lived. She bought groceries with coupons, learned to cook simple meals, and discovered the peculiar satisfaction of making $20 stretch through an entire weekend. Her neighbors, a mix of young professionals and artists, knew her as Jules, the friendly waitress who occasionally brought leftover desserts from the restaurant. At night, she would sometimes stand on her tiny balcony, looking out at the Denver skyline, and feel genuinely happy for the first time since childhood. She had friends who liked her for her personality. She had work that challenged her. She had built something entirely her own, without her father's influence or her family's reputation smoothing the way, but she was also completely unprepared for Preston Thornton. He first walked into Rustic Table on a rainy Thursday evening in October, part of a business dinner group celebrating the completion of a major commercial development project. Preston was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying, tall and confident with an easy smile that suggested he found life generally amusing. While his colleagues focused on their stakes and deal negotiations, Preston found himself distracted by the waitress who seemed to anticipate their needs before they voiced them. Julianne noticed him immediately, not because of his expensive suit or authoritative presence, but because he was the only member of his party who made eye contact when she took his order, who said please and thank you like he meant it, who stacked his plates to make her job easier. In her previous life, she had met countless wealthy, powerful men who treated service staff like invisible furniture. Preston's basic courtesy stood out like a beacon. When the business dinner concluded and his colleagues headed to their cars, Preston lingered at the table, nursing a cup of coffee and stealing glances at Julianne as she moved efficiently between her other tables. Finally, as she approached to clear his setting, he worked up the courage to speak. "I hope this doesn't sound inappropriate," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of nervousness that she found completely charming, "but would you maybe like to get coffee sometime? Somewhere you don't have to serve it to me." Julianne's first instinct was panic. In her old life, such invitations came loaded with ulterior motives. But looking at Preston, seeing the genuine uncertainty in his expression, the way he was clearly stepping outside his comfort zone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of a connection based on nothing more than mutual interest. "I'd like that," she heard herself saying, surprised by how much she meant it. Their first official date was at a small cafe in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, chosen specifically because it was the kind of place where a construction company executive and a restaurant server might naturally meet. Preston arrived 15 minutes early, had clearly spent time selecting his outfit, and stood when she approached the table. He pulled out her chair, asked thoughtful questions about her life, and listened to her answers with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like the most interesting person in the world. She told him carefully crafted truths about growing up in California, about wanting a fresh start in Denver, about enjoying the service industry because it allowed her to make people happy. He shared stories about his family's construction business, about the satisfaction of building something lasting, about his complicated relationship with his mother's social expectations. They talked for 4 hours, closing down the cafe, and Julianne realized she had completely forgotten to monitor her responses for any slip-ups that might reveal her true background. Preston was refreshingly uncomplicated. He worked hard, loved his job, maintained a small circle of close friends, and had never been particularly interested in the social climbing that seemed to obsess so many people in his economic bracket. His family business was successful but not extravagant. They built quality commercial and residential projects, employed loyal crews, and had a reputation for finishing on time and under budget. It was honest work that he took pride in. What drew Julianne to him most powerfully was his complete lack of pretension. He drove a practical pickup truck because it was useful for his work, not because he was trying to project an image. He chose restaurants based on the quality of the food, not the prestige of being seen there. He wore jeans and work boots as comfortably as he wore suits, and he treated everyone he encountered, from valets to CEOs, with the same fundamental respect. For 3 months, they fell into an easy rhythm of dating. Preston would pick her up after her shifts, and they would explore Denver together. Food truck festivals where they shared Korean tacos and Venezuelan arepas. Hiking trails in the foothills where they would pack simple lunches and talk for hours. Independent movie theaters showing foreign films that sparked passionate discussions lasting long into the night. Julianne had dated men who took her to exclusive events where champagne cost $500 a bottle, but she had never felt as genuinely entertained as she did watching Preston get competitive at a miniature golf course, or listening to him explain the engineering challenges behind the historic buildings they passed on their walks. The moment she knew she was falling in love was painfully ordinary and absolutely perfect. They had spent a Saturday afternoon at the Denver Art Museum, where Preston surprised her with his thoughtful observations about contemporary pieces. Afterward, they stopped at a grocery store to buy ingredients for dinner, and Julianne watched him carefully compare prices on pasta brands, genuinely concerned about finding the best value. It was such a foreign concept to her that someone would spend even 30 seconds considering whether to spend $12 or $14 on dinner ingredients, but she found his conscientiousness endearing rather than limiting. Standing in that grocery store aisle, watching the man she was falling in love with debate the merits of different olive oils, Julianne felt a stab of guilt so sharp it took her breath away. Every moment of their relationship was built on deception. He had no idea that she could afford to buy the entire grocery store chain without checking her bank balance. He had no idea that her modest lifestyle was an elaborate performance. He had no idea that she was living the most honest and authentic life she had ever experienced while lying to him about every fundamental detail of her identity, but she also knew that if she revealed the truth, everything would change. Preston would start seeing her differently, questioning her motives, wondering if their connection was real or manufactured. The easy equality between them would disappear, replaced by the complicated dynamics that money always introduced into relationships. She had escaped that world specifically to avoid those complications. So she decided to let the deception continue, telling herself it was temporary, that eventually she would find the right moment to reveal everything. She had no way of knowing that her decision to maintain the lie would set in motion a series of events that would nearly destroy both their lives, and force her to confront the true cost of hiding who she really was. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. 6 months into their relationship, Preston suggested it was time for Julianne to meet his family. The invitation came casually over breakfast at their favorite diner, but she could sense the underlying significance in his voice. This wasn't just another step in their dating progression, it was his way of signaling that he saw a future with her. My mother's planning her annual charity gala, Preston explained, cutting into his stack of pancakes with the methodical precision he applied to everything in his life. It's a big deal for her, raises money for the children's hospital. She's been asking when she'll get to meet the woman who's been monopolizing all my time. Julianne's coffee suddenly tasted bitter. She had been dreading this moment since their third date, when she realized their relationship was becoming serious. Meeting Preston's family meant submitting herself to scrutiny, to questions about her background, to the kind of social evaluation that could expose cracks in her carefully constructed identity. "What kind of event is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral while her mind raced through the potential complications. "Black tie, unfortunately. Mom insists on the full, formal treatment. About 200 guests, mostly business contacts and family friends. Don't worry though, I'll be right there with you the whole time." Preston reached across the table and squeezed her hand, misinterpreting her hesitation as anxiety about fitting into his social circle. He had no idea that she had attended dozens of similar events, that she knew exactly which fork to use for each course, that she could navigate high society conversations in her sleep. Her concern wasn't about fitting in, it was about fitting in too well and raising suspicions about her supposed background. The Thornton family lived in Cherry Hills Village, an exclusive enclave south of Denver where successful business families built sprawling estates behind privacy gates and manicured landscapes. Their house was impressive by most standards, a colonial revival with commanding views of the Front Range, but it was modest compared to the properties Julianne had grown up visiting. Still, she made sure to react with appropriate appreciation as Preston's truck wound up the circular driveway. "This is beautiful," she said, and meant it. There was something appealing about the house's understated elegance, the way it projected success without ostentation. Preston's father, William Thornton, greeted them at the door with genuine warmth. He was a larger, slightly weathered version of his son, with calloused hands that spoke of a man who still got involved in the physical aspects of his business. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his smile reaching his eyes as he welcomed Julianne into their home. "So you're the famous Jules," William said, using the casual name Preston had told his family. "Preston talks about you constantly. We were starting to wonder if you were imaginary." Julianne felt herself relaxing slightly. William Thornton seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her, asking thoughtful questions about her work at the restaurant, her impressions of Denver, her plans for the future. He listened to her answers with the kind of respectful attention that suggested he judged people by their character rather than their credentials. Then Margaret Thornton entered the room. Preston's mother was a striking woman in her mid-50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of posture that suggested extensive etiquette training. She wore a cashmere twin set that probably cost more than Julianne's monthly rent, paired with pearls that were definitely real and definitely expensive. But it wasn't her appearance that put Julianne on edge, it was the calculating way Margaret's eyes swept over her, taking inventory of every detail from her department store dress to her modest jewelry. "Mother," Preston said, his voice carrying a warning note that Julianne didn't miss, "this is Julianne." Margaret's smile was perfect and completely cold. "How lovely to finally meet you, dear. Preston has told us so much about you." The way she emphasized "so much" made it sound like a criticism rather than a compliment. The family dinner that followed was an exercise in subtle psychological warfare. Margaret had clearly done research, asking questions that seemed innocent but were designed to probe for inconsistencies in Julianne's story. Where exactly in California had she grown up? What had her parents done for work? Why had she chosen Denver specifically? Each inquiry was delivered with the sweetest possible tone, making Julianne's carefully neutral responses sound defensive. It must be such an adjustment, Margaret mused over the main course, going from California to Colorado. I imagine the lifestyle is quite different. More modest. Julianne recognized the trap immediately. Margaret was fishing for information about her family's economic status, trying to determine whether she came from money and was slumming for some inexplicable reason, or whether she was genuinely from a working-class background and therefore potentially motivated by financial gain. I actually prefer it here, Julianne replied smoothly. There's something refreshing about a place where people are valued for what they do rather than who they know. It was a perfectly crafted response that could be interpreted multiple ways, but Margaret's expression suggested she had heard exactly the message Julianne intended, that she considered herself above the kind of social maneuvering that Margaret clearly prized. The conversation grew more pointed as the evening progressed. Margaret mentioned, seemingly casually, that Preston's ex-girlfriend Catherine had been a lovely girl from a prominent local family. She wondered aloud whether Julianne had any interest in charity work, since it was so important for wives in their social circle to contribute meaningfully to the community. She asked about Julianne's education with the kind of persistent curiosity that suggested she had already made inquiries and found the answers unsatisfactory. Preston tried to deflect the more aggressive questioning, but Julianne could see him becoming increasingly uncomfortable with his mother's behavior. By the time they reached dessert, the tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. I'm sorry about that, Preston said during the drive back to Julianne's apartment. Mom can be a bit intense when she meets someone new. She's just protective. Julianne wanted to point out that what they had just experienced went far beyond maternal protectiveness into outright hostility, but she recognized that Preston was caught in an impossible position. Instead, she squeezed his hand and assured him that she understood family dynamics could be complicated, but privately, she knew that Margaret Thornton had identified her as a threat and would not rest until she had either driven Julianne away or exposed whatever secrets she suspected were being hidden. The war between them had officially begun. Over the following months, Margaret's campaign against Julianne became increasingly sophisticated. She would invite Preston to family events and forget to extend the invitation to his girlfriend. She would make casual references to eligible young women from appropriate families, wondering aloud why Preston was wasting his time with someone so clearly unsuitable. She began asking pointed questions about Julianne's finances, her family background, her long-term intentions. The psychological pressure was relentless and expertly applied. Margaret had clearly studied the art of social manipulation, knowing exactly how to plant seeds of doubt without seeming overtly hostile. She would praise Julianne's appearance while simultaneously pointing out how expensive proper formal wear could be. She would compliment her intelligence while expressing concern that someone with her limited educational background might not understand the complexities of business ownership. Most insidiously, Margaret began working to isolate Julianne from Preston's social circle. At parties and gatherings, she would introduce Julianne as Preston's friend from the restaurant, emphasizing her service job in a way that made it sound temporary and insignificant. She would steer conversations toward topics that required knowledge of elite social conventions, then watch with satisfaction as Julianne either revealed too much familiarity with high society or struggled to participate meaningfully. The worst part was watching the effect on Preston. He was caught between loyalty to his mother and his deepening feelings for Julianne, and the constant tension was wearing him down. He started making excuses for his mother's behavior, then apologizing for the excuses, then getting frustrated with the entire situation. Their relationship began to show strain as external pressure mounted from all sides. Julianne found herself living a triple life: the authentic person she was becoming through her relationship with Preston, the working-class persona she maintained for his family, and the wealthy heiress she actually was. The emotional exhaustion of constantly monitoring her responses, crafting appropriate reactions, and suppressing her natural instincts was beginning to take a serious toll. At work, her performance suffered as she struggled to concentrate on orders while replaying conversations with Margaret, analyzing every word for potential missteps. Her coworkers noticed her distraction, her manager Carlos expressing concern about her obvious stress. She wanted desperately to confide in someone about the impossible situation she had created, but doing so would require revealing the fundamental deception that underpinned her entire Denver existence. The breaking point came during Preston's 30th birthday celebration. Margaret had organized an intimate dinner party at the country club, carefully selecting guests who would highlight the social gulf between their family and Julianne's supposed background. The evening was a masterclass in subtle humiliation, with Margaret ensuring that Julianne was seated between two women who spent the entire meal discussing private school experiences, European vacations, and charity board appointments that might as well have been conducted in a foreign language, but Julianne's years of elite social training kicked in unconsciously. She found herself contributing knowledgeably to discussions about art auctions, making casual references to restaurants in cities she wasn't supposed to have visited, demonstrating familiarity with cultural events that someone of her claimed background would never have attended. Several times, she caught herself just before revealing information that would have exposed her true identity, but the close calls left her shaken. Margaret noticed everything. By the end of the evening, her expression had shifted from condescending superiority to calculating suspicion. She had clearly detected inconsistencies in Julianne's presentation, gaps between her supposed background and her actual knowledge base. 2 weeks later, Preston mentioned casually that his mother had been asking more detailed questions about Julianne's past. Nothing accusatory, he assured her, just normal curiosity about the woman her son was serious about. But Julianne recognized the signs of a more intensive investigation beginning. She started noticing unfamiliar cars parked near her apartment building. Her manager at Rustic Table mentioned that someone had called asking about her employment history. Her landlord casually mentioned that a woman claiming to be from a background check company had inquired about her rental application details. Margaret Thornton was conducting surveillance, and Julianne realized with growing alarm that her carefully constructed identity was about to face its most serious test. The question was whether her deception was sophisticated enough to survive professional scrutiny, or whether the truth about her billions would come to light in the most damaging way possible. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She had spent her entire adult life trying to escape the assumptions and complications that came with extreme wealth, only to find herself trapped by different but equally destructive assumptions about her supposed poverty. Margaret's conviction that she was a gold digger was creating exactly the kind of relationship toxicity that Julianne had been trying to avoid by hiding her fortune in the first place. As she lay awake at night, listening to Preston sleep beside her and worrying about the investigation closing in around her fabricated identity, Julianne began to understand that her experiment in living authentically had instead created the most complex deception of her life. She was going to have to make a choice: reveal the truth and risk losing the only genuine relationship she had ever experienced, or maintain the lie and watch it slowly poison everything she had worked to build. Neither option seemed bearable. But the decision was rapidly being taken out of her hands. The private investigator Margaret hired was thorough, methodical, and expensive. Richard Hawkins specialized in what he diplomatically called domestic background verification, which meant he made his living exposing the secrets that people preferred to keep hidden from their romantic partners and potential in-laws. His client list included suspicious spouses, concerned parents, and nervous business partners who needed to know exactly who they were dealing with. Margaret had found him through her tennis partner at the country club, who had used his services when her daughter became engaged to a man with suspiciously vague explanations about his previous marriages. The recommendation came with glowing praise for Hawkins' discretion and his ability to uncover information that subjects believed was safely buried in their past. "I need to know everything," Margaret told him during their initial consultation at his downtown office. "Where she really comes from, what her family situation actually is, whether she has any criminal background, any previous marriages, any children she's hiding. Most importantly, I need to know what her real financial situation looks like." Hawkins nodded, making notes on his legal pad with the practiced efficiency of someone who had heard similar requests hundreds of times before. Wealthy families protecting their assets from potential gold diggers represented a significant portion of his business. The subject goes by Julianne Roberts, claims to be from California, works as a server at Rustic Table downtown. Margaret continued, sliding a folder across his desk containing every piece of information she had gathered during months of seemingly casual conversations. "But something doesn't add up. She's too comfortable in social situations, knows too much about things she shouldn't know about, and there are gaps in her story that suggest she's hiding something significant." What Margaret didn't realize was that her instincts were absolutely correct, but her assumptions about what Julianne was hiding were completely backwards. Hawkins began his investigation expecting to uncover evidence of financial desperation, criminal activity, or previous attempts to marry wealthy men for their money. Instead, he found something far more puzzling: a young woman who seemed to have materialized out of thin air approximately 18 months earlier. The initial research yielded frustratingly little concrete information. Julianne Roberts had a social security number, a clean credit report, and employment records that checked out, but her digital footprint was remarkably sparse for someone her age. No high school yearbook photos, no college alumni associations, no social media presence. extending back more than 2 years. Her rental application had been approved based on excellent references and a substantial security deposit, but the previous addresses she had listed led to dead ends when Hawkins tried to verify them. Most suspiciously, her financial behavior made no sense for someone allegedly living paycheck to paycheck. She had paid 6 months of rent in advance, in cash, when she first moved to Denver. Her credit report showed zero debt, which was unusual for someone supposedly working their way up from modest circumstances. The used Honda she drove had been purchased outright, without financing, for $12,000 cash. "She's definitely hiding something," Hawkins reported to Margaret during their first follow-up meeting. "But it's not what you think. This woman has money, maybe significant money, and she's going to considerable lengths to conceal it. The question is why someone would pretend to be poor when they're actually wealthy." Margaret's first reaction was disbelief. The idea that someone would voluntarily live in a cramped apartment and work demanding service jobs while sitting on substantial assets seemed absurd. But as Hawkins laid out his evidence, a different picture began to emerge. The investigator had discovered that Julianne's apartment was in a building owned by a property management company that specialized in high-end clients who valued privacy above luxury. The building's other tenants included a retired federal judge, a best-selling author who wrote under a pseudonym, and the adult son of a prominent senator who was trying to establish his own identity separate from his family's political legacy. It was exactly the kind of place where someone might go to disappear from their previous life. More tellingly, Hawkins had observed Julianne's behavior during several surveillance sessions. She moved through expensive stores with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to shopping there, though she rarely purchased anything. She had been seen reading the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times at coffee shops, publications that seemed incongruous with her supposed background. Most significantly, she had been photographed having lunch with a man in an expensive suit at the Four Seasons, a meeting that looked decidedly more business-oriented than social. "I need you to dig deeper," Margaret instructed, her mind racing with possibilities. If Julianne was wealthy, what was her endgame? Was she conducting some elaborate psychological experiment? Was she married to someone else and living a double life? Was she involved in something illegal that required maintaining false identities? The deeper Hawkins dug, the more mysterious Julianne's situation became. He discovered that her name change had been processed through a law firm that specialized in privacy protection for high-net-worth individuals. The legal work had been handled by attorneys who typically charged more per hour than most people made in a month. Someone had invested serious money in creating Julianne Roberts' identity, which suggested either tremendous wealth or criminal activity requiring sophisticated laundering. Meanwhile, Julianne was becoming increasingly aware that she was under surveillance. The same sedan appeared in her neighborhood too frequently to be coincidental. A woman claiming to be from a market research company had called asking oddly specific questions about her shopping preferences and lifestyle choices. Her coworkers at Rustic Table mentioned customers who seemed more interested in watching her work than in eating their meals. The psychological pressure was intense and unrelenting. Every conversation with Preston's family became a minefield of potential exposure. Margaret had begun asking increasingly specific questions about Julianne's childhood, her parents' occupations, her educational background, always with the sweet smile that barely concealed her predatory intentions. "Tell me about your high school experience," Margaret would say during family dinners, her tone suggesting casual interest while her eyes watched for any sign of deception. "Preston went to Denver Prep, and he always talks about how those formative years shaped his character. Where did you attend school again?" Julianne had prepared answers for these questions, complete with fabricated details about teachers, classmates, and school events, but the constant need to maintain consistency across multiple conversations was exhausting. She found herself writing notes after each interaction with Margaret, tracking what information she had revealed and what follow-up questions might be coming. The stress was affecting every aspect of her life. At work, she made mistakes that were completely uncharacteristic, forgetting orders and mixing up table assignments while her mind churned through the growing complexity of her deception. Her relationship with Preston was becoming strained as she struggled to balance honesty with self-preservation. Preston, meanwhile, was caught in an increasingly uncomfortable position between his mother's obvious hostility toward Julianne and his own deepening commitment to their relationship. He had begun planning to propose, had already selected a ring and started thinking about the kind of wedding that would make Julianne happy. But his mother's constant questions and barely disguised disapproval were creating a toxic atmosphere that threatened to poison his happiness. "Mom, you need to back off," he told Margaret during one of their weekly lunches, his patience finally reaching its limit. "Julianne is a good person who makes me happy. Your constant interrogation is making both of us miserable." Margaret's response was to double down on her investigation while adopting a more subtle approach to her questioning. Instead of direct confrontation, she began setting elaborate traps designed to catch Julianne in inconsistencies. She would mention expensive restaurants in Los Angeles, watching to see if Julianne showed any recognition. She would reference exclusive private schools, exclusive country clubs, expensive vacation destinations, always probing for signs of familiarity. That would contradict Julianne's claimed background. The most dangerous moment came during a family gathering to celebrate William Thornton's birthday. Margaret had invited her sister Victoria, a sharp-eyed woman who made her living as a high-end real estate agent specializing in luxury properties. Victoria had an encyclopedic knowledge of wealthy families and their properties throughout the western United States. "You have such interesting features," Victoria told Julianne during cocktails, studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You remind me of someone, but I can't quite place who. Have we met before? Maybe through mutual friends in California." Julianne's blood ran cold. Victoria was clearly fishing for information, trying to place her within the social circles she knew professionally. If Victoria had ever shown properties to the Martinez family or encountered Julianne at high society events, the game would be over immediately. "I don't think so," Julianne replied carefully. "I've been told I have one of those familiar faces. People are always thinking they recognize me from somewhere." But Victoria continued to watch her throughout the evening, her expression suggesting she was working through mental files of every wealthy family she had ever encountered. The scrutiny was so intense that Julianne excused herself early, claiming a sudden headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. The investigation was closing in from multiple directions, and Julianne realized that her carefully constructed identity was developing cracks that would soon become impossible to conceal. Hawkins had traced her previous addresses back to a mail forwarding service that catered to people trying to obscure their true locations. He had identified the law firm that had handled her name change and was working on convincing someone there to provide information about their client. Most dangerously, he had begun investigating her employment history, contacting previous employers and trying to verify her work experience. If he traced her background far enough, he would eventually discover that Julianne Roberts had never worked in food service before Denver, that her resume contained gaps that could only be explained by the kind of privileged lifestyle that made employment unnecessary. The walls were closing in, and Julianne found herself trapped between two equally terrifying possibilities. She could confess the truth and risk destroying her relationship with Preston, who might never forgive her for the elaborate deception she had maintained for over a year. Or she could continue the lie and hope that her false identity was sophisticated enough to survive professional investigation, knowing that discovery at this point would make her look calculating and manipulative. Either choice seemed likely to cost her the only authentic happiness she had ever known. As she lay awake at night listening to Preston's peaceful breathing, she understood that her experiment in living normally had instead created the most complex and dangerous deception of her life. The irony was bitter and complete. In trying to escape the complications that came with extreme wealth, she had created a situation where her hidden billions were about to destroy everything she truly valued. Margaret's conviction that she was a gold digger was about to expose the truth that she was actually richer than the entire Thornton family combined, but the revelation would come too late to save the relationship she had sacrificed everything to protect. The investigation was accelerating, Margaret's suspicions were growing stronger, and time was running out for Julianne to control how and when the truth would finally come to light. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in late spring, when Denver's downtown core was alive with the energy of professionals celebrating the end of another work week. Julianne had just finished a particularly demanding shift at Rustic Table, handling a series of difficult customers and covering for a coworker who had called in sick. She was exhausted, her feet aching from 8 hours in service shoes, looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening at home with Preston. But as she stepped out of the restaurant's back entrance into the alley where employees parked, she found Margaret Thornton waiting beside her Honda, flanked by a man in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of professional authority that made Julianne's stomach drop. "Good evening, Julianne," Margaret said, her voice carrying a tone of barely contained triumph. "I'd like you to meet Richard Hawkins. He's been looking into your background, and he's discovered some very interesting information that I think we should discuss." Hawkins stepped forward, extending his hand with the practiced courtesy of someone accustomed to delivering uncomfortable revelations to unwilling subjects. "Miss Roberts, or should I say Miss Martinez? I believe we have quite a bit to talk about." The use of her real surname hit Julianne like a physical blow. After 18 months of successful deception, hearing her true identity spoken aloud in this context felt like watching her carefully constructed world collapse in real time. She looked around the empty alley, calculating distances to potential escape routes, but realized immediately that running would only confirm their suspicions and make everything worse. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the panic coursing through her system. "My name is Julianne Roberts. I don't know who this Martinez person is supposed to be." Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, I think you know exactly who she is. Daughter of Diego Martinez, heir to Martinez Holdings, worth approximately $3 billion according to the most recent Forbes estimates. The same Julianne Martinez who disappeared from Los Angeles high society 18 months ago, leaving behind a trust fund that generates more interest per day than most people earn in a year." Hawkins opened a manila folder, revealing photographs and documents that made Julianne's knees weak. There was her Harvard graduation photo, her picture from a charity gala in Beverly Hills, a copy of her birth certificate showing her real parentage. And most damaging of all, recent surveillance photos showing her meeting with her family's financial advisors at upscale Denver hotels. The legal name change was expertly handled, Hawkins continued in the tone of someone delivering a professional presentation. The identity creation was sophisticated enough to fool casual investigation. But your behavioral patterns gave you away. Nobody with a genuine working-class background moves through luxury establishments with that level of comfort. Nobody earning server wages pays 6 months of rent in advance with cash. And nobody trying to hide poverty uses a law firm that charges $5,000 per hour for privacy protection services. Julianne realized that her silence was confirming their accusations more effectively than any confession could. But she also understood that the game was over, that months of careful deception had been unraveled by professional investigation and her own unconscious habits. "What do you want?" she asked quietly, abandoning any pretense of maintaining her false identity. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes glittering with the satisfaction of a predator who had successfully cornered her prey. "I want you to explain to my son exactly who you are and why you've been lying to him for over a year. I want you to tell him that his girlfriend is a billionaire who's been playing dress-up as a waitress for her own amusement. I want you to confess that this entire relationship has been built on deception." "That's not true," Julianne said fiercely, finding her voice as maternal fury overrode her fear. "My feelings for Preston are completely genuine. The only lie was about my background, not about my emotions or my commitment to him." "How convenient," Margaret sneered. "The billionaire heiress claims she was slumming for love. Do you really expect anyone to believe that someone with your resources would voluntarily scrub tables and serve drinks unless there was some ulterior motive?" Hawkins cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Thornton, if I may, the evidence suggests that Miss Martinez has been living this lifestyle consistently for 18 months, well before she met your son. Whatever her motivations, this doesn't appear to be a targeted deception designed specifically to trap him." But Margaret wasn't interested in nuance or alternative explanations. She had spent months convinced that Julianne was a gold digger, and the revelation of hidden wealth only convinced her that the deception was more elaborate and therefore more malicious than she had originally suspected. "I don't care about her motivations," Margaret said coldly. "I care about the fact that she's been lying to my family for over a year. Preston deserves to know the truth about the woman he's planning to propose to." The mention of an imminent proposal hit Julianne like another physical blow. She had suspected that Preston was moving in that direction, had caught him researching jewelry stores and acting mysteriously about his weekend plans, but hearing it confirmed in this context made the situation exponentially more devastating. "Please," Julianne said, her composed facade finally cracking. "Let me tell him myself. Let me explain the situation in my own way, in private. He deserves to hear this from me, not to have it thrown at him as an accusation." Margaret's laugh was harsh and completely without humor. "You've had over a year to tell him the truth voluntarily. Instead, you've chosen to continue the deception, making it worse with every passing day. Why should I trust you to be honest now when you've proven yourself to be a compulsive liar?" "Because I love him," Julianne said simply, the words carrying a weight of sincerity that momentarily silenced even Margaret's hostility. "Because destroying his trust in me will hurt him more than it will hurt me, and despite what you think of me, I don't want to cause him pain." But Margaret was beyond being swayed by appeals to her son's emotional well-being. In her mind, Julianne represented a fundamental threat to everything she had planned for Preston's future, and the revelation of her true identity only made her more dangerous. "You should have thought about that before you decided to build your relationship on lies," Margaret said with finality. "Tomorrow evening, we're having a family dinner to celebrate Preston's promotion to senior partner. You'll be there, and you'll tell him the truth about who you are, or I'll do it for you. Either way, this charade ends tomorrow night." She turned and walked toward her Mercedes, parked at the mouth of the alley, leaving Hawkins to gather his documents and follow her. But before he left, the investigator turned back to Julianne with something that might have been sympathy. For what it's worth, he said quietly, in 20 years of doing this job, I've never seen someone work as hard as you have to live a normal life. Most people in your situation are trying to hide debt or criminal activity. You're the first person I've investigated who was trying to hide wealth. It must have been exhausting. Then he was gone, leaving Julianne alone in the alley with the wreckage of her carefully constructed identity scattered around her feet. She drove home in a daze, her mind racing through possible scenarios for the following evening's confrontation. She could confess everything to Preston immediately, hoping that 18 months of genuine relationship would outweigh the deception. She could disappear overnight, returning to Los Angeles and leaving him with nothing but questions and hurt feelings. She could attempt to discredit Margaret's investigation, claiming the evidence was fabricated or mistaken, but every option seemed to lead to the same devastating conclusion, the end of the only authentic happiness she had ever experienced. Preston was waiting in her apartment when she arrived, having used the key she had given him months earlier. He was cooking dinner, humming softly to himself as he chopped vegetables for a pasta sauce, completely unaware that his entire world was about to change. The domestic normalcy of the scene made Julianne's heart ache with the knowledge of what she was about to lose. "How was work?" he asked, kissing her cheek as she entered the kitchen. "You look exhausted. Rough shift?" "Something like that," she managed, watching him move around her tiny kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged there. This was what she had been trying to preserve, the simple pleasure of shared meals and easy conversation, the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other well enough to exist peacefully in the same space. They ate dinner while Preston told her about his day, about the new project his firm had landed, about his excitement over the promotion that Margaret had mentioned. He was animated and happy, full of plans for their future together, and Julianne found herself memorizing every detail of his expressions, knowing that this might be the last time she would see him look at her with uncomplicated love. "Actually," he said as they finished the meal, "I have something I wanted to discuss with you. About us, about where we're heading." Julianne's breath caught in her throat. The proposal was coming tonight, before Margaret's ultimatum could destroy everything. She was going to have to accept an engagement under false pretenses or reject the man she loved to protect him from her own deception. "Preston," she began, but he held up his hand with a smile. "Let me finish this thought," he said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I know we haven't been together as long as some couples before they take this step, but I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You make me want to be better than I am. You make ordinary moments feel extraordinary. You've shown me what it means to love someone for who they are rather than what they can provide." The irony of his words was like a knife through her heart. He was praising her for the very authenticity that she had been systematically denying him through months of carefully constructed lies. "Julianne Roberts," he said, dropping to one knee in her cramped apartment kitchen, "will you marry me?" The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, a classic solitaire that he had clearly chosen with great care and considerable sacrifice. She could see in his eyes the nervousness and hope of someone laying his heart completely bare, trusting in the connection they had built together, and in that moment, looking at the man she loved more than she had ever thought possible, Julianne realized that she couldn't begin their engagement with a lie, even if the truth would destroy everything they had together. "Preston," she said softly, her voice breaking with the weight of what she was about to confess, "before I answer that question, there's something I need to tell you about who I really am." Preston's face went through a series of expressions as he processed Julianne's words, still kneeling on her kitchen floor with the engagement ring box open in his hands. Confusion gave way to concern, then to a dawning realization that whatever she was about to tell him was significant enough to interrupt what should have been one of the happiest moments of their lives together. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly, slowly rising to his feet but not closing the ring box, as if keeping it open might somehow preserve the possibility of the future they had been building toward. Julianne took a deep breath, understanding that the next few minutes would either destroy their relationship or transform it into something completely different. There was no going back from this moment, no way to unsay what she was about to reveal. "My real name isn't Julianne Roberts," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "It's Julianne Martinez. My father is Diego Martinez, and I'm the heir to Martinez Holdings." Preston's expression didn't change immediately, as if the words were taking time to process. Then his eyebrows furrowed in the way they did when he was trying to solve a complicated problem at work. "Martinez Holdings," he repeated slowly. "The restaurant empire? The company that owns half the dining establishments in major cities across the country?" "Among other things, yes," Julianne said, watching his face as the full implications began to sink in. "Preston, I'm worth approximately $3 billion. I've been lying to you about my background since the day we met." The ring box slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor as Preston staggered backward until he hit the counter. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at her as if she had just told him she was from another planet. $3 billion, he whispered, then louder, $3 billion? You're telling me that while I've been saving for months to buy you a ring, while I've been worried about whether I could afford the kind of wedding you deserve, you've been secretly worth more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes? The hurt in his voice was devastating, but Julianne pressed on, knowing that stopping now would only make things worse. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have. Every relationship I'd ever had before you was poisoned by money. Men who pretended to care about me but were really interested in my trust fund. Friends who only called when they needed loans or investments. I came to Denver to escape all of that, to see if I could find something real. Something real? Preston's voice cracked. You think building a relationship on fundamental lies is real? You think letting me stress about paying for dinner dates while you could have bought the restaurant is real? He began pacing around her small living room, his hands running through his hair in the way they did when he was trying to process overwhelming information. God, Julianne, or whoever you are. Do you have any idea what this feels like? I've been defending you to my mother for over a year, telling her that your background didn't matter, that you were genuine and honest and everything she claimed you weren't. And now I find out that she was right all along, you were hiding something massive. She wasn't right about why I was hiding it, Julianne said desperately. Your mother assumed I was after your money. The truth is the exact opposite. I have more money than your entire family combined. I was trying to prove that I could be loved without it. Preston stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression shifting from hurt to something closer to anger. You were trying to prove something? This was all some kind of experiment to you? Playing house with the middle-class guy to see how the other half lives? No, Julianne said firmly. It wasn't an experiment. It was the most honest I've ever been in my life, except for the one thing I couldn't tell you without risking everything. The one thing? Preston laughed bitterly. Julianne, your entire identity was a lie. Your job, your apartment, your car, your concerns about money, all of it was performance art. How am I supposed to know what was real and what was part of your elaborate deception? She wanted to tell him that her feelings had always been real. That every moment of tenderness between them had been genuine, that the love she felt for him was the most authentic emotion she had ever experienced. But looking at his face, seeing the betrayal and confusion written there, she realized that her words carried no weight now that the foundation of trust between them had been shattered. Your mother knows, she said quietly. She hired a private investigator who figured it out. She confronted me tonight after work and gave me an ultimatum: tell you the truth or she would do it herself at tomorrow's family dinner. Preston's expression hardened further. So you're only telling me now because you got caught? If my mother hadn't figured it out, you would have let me propose, let us get engaged, maybe even married, without ever knowing who you really are. The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Julianne realized with growing horror that she didn't have a good answer. She had been planning to tell him eventually, had rehearsed the conversation countless times in her mind, but she had never actually set a deadline for the revelation. Left to her own devices, would she have found the courage to confess before their relationship reached the point of permanent commitment? I don't know, she admitted, the honesty feeling like another betrayal even as she spoke it. I kept telling myself I would find the right moment, but every day that passed made it harder to imagine how to explain the deception without destroying what we had built together. Preston sank onto her couch, his head in his hands. When he looked up again, his eyes were red-rimmed with unshed tears. Do you understand what you've done to me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I was going to propose tonight because I thought I knew you. I thought we had built something together based on honesty and mutual respect. I thought you were the woman who worked double shifts to pay her own way, who insisted on splitting dinner checks because independence mattered to you, who worried about saving enough money to take a vacation. I am that woman, Julianne insisted. Just because I have money doesn't mean those experiences weren't real to me. I chose to work those shifts, I chose to live modestly, I chose to build a life with you based on who we are together, not what either of us could provide financially. But it was all a choice for you, Preston said, his voice growing stronger as his anger overtook his hurt. When you got tired of playing poor, you could have walked away at any time. When work got stressful, you could have quit without worrying about rent or groceries. When we talked about our future together, about saving for a house or planning for retirement, you were humoring me because none of those concerns actually applied to your life. Julianne felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the full extent of the damage became clear. Every conversation they had shared about hopes and dreams and practical concerns had been fundamentally unequal because she had been operating with complete financial security while he had been making real sacrifices and compromises. I never meant for it to go this far, she said through her tears. I fell in love with you faster and harder than I expected, and then I didn't know how to tell you without losing you. So instead you chose to lie to me every single day," Preston replied. "Every morning when you got up for work, every time you let me pay for something because you were supposedly tight on money, every conversation we had about budgeting or financial planning, you were actively deceiving me." He stood up abruptly, grabbing his jacket from the chair where he had draped it earlier when the evening had still held the promise of celebration and commitment. "I need time," he said, not looking at her as he headed toward the door. "I need to process this, to figure out what was real and what was part of your performance. I need to understand how the woman I thought I knew could have been hiding something this fundamental about herself." "Preston, please," Julianne called after him, but he was already at the door. "The woman I fell in love with doesn't exist," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "She was a character you created, a role you played. I don't know who Julianne Martinez is, and I'm not sure I want to find out." The door closed behind him with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the apartment with devastating finality. Julianne stood in her kitchen, looking at the engagement ring that still lay on the floor where Preston had dropped it, understanding that she had just lost the most important thing in her life by trying too hard to protect it. Outside, she could hear Preston's truck starting up, the sound of him driving away from the life they had built together and might never be able to rebuild. The silence that followed was complete and crushing, filled with the weight of 18 months of deception and the recognition that her experiment in authentic living had instead created the most elaborate lie of her life. The irony was perfect and horrible. In trying to prove that she could be loved without her money, she had instead demonstrated that love couldn't survive without honesty. Her billions were about to buy her exactly what they always had, a life of isolation and regret, with the added pain of knowing what she had lost through her own choices. Tomorrow's family dinner would bring additional humiliation as Margaret revealed the truth to the rest of the Thornton family, but tonight, alone in her apartment with the engagement ring glittering accusingly on the floor, Julianne understood that the real damage had already been done. The man she loved more than anything in the world was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. The next morning arrived with all the mercy of a hangover, dragging Julianne from a restless sleep filled with nightmares where she was perpetually explaining herself to a courtroom of Prestons, each one looking at her with increasing disappointment. She had spent most of the night on her living room floor, alternately staring at the engagement ring and checking her phone for messages that never came. By dawn, she had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She was going to call her father. Diego Martinez answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had been awake since 5 conducting business with European partners. But the moment he heard his daughter's tear-roughened voice, his tone shifted to the gentle concern that had carried her through childhood's scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. "Mija, what's wrong?" he asked, and the familiar endearment nearly broke her composure entirely. "Daddy," she whispered, reverting to the name she hadn't used since boarding school, "I think I've ruined everything." Within 6 hours, Diego Martinez was sitting in her tiny Denver apartment, looking completely out of place on her second-hand furniture but treating the cramped space with the same respect he would have shown a boardroom. He had listened without interruption as she told him everything: the elaborate deception, the investigation, Preston's devastation, the impending family dinner where her humiliation would be complete. "You know what I'm going to say," Diego said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "That I should have told him from the beginning," Julianne replied, curled into the corner of her couch like a child seeking comfort. "That you should have trusted him," Diego corrected. "And more importantly, that you should have trusted yourself. You spent so much energy proving you could be loved without money that you forgot the most important truth: real love survives difficult revelations. If Preston Thornton is the man you believe him to be, he'll find his way back to what matters." "But what if he's not?" Julianne asked. "What if discovering that I lied about something so fundamental changes how he sees everything else about our relationship?" Diego was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter with the same analytical intensity he brought to business negotiations. Finally, he sighed deeply. "Then you'll learn a painful but valuable lesson about the difference between loving someone and loving the idea of someone," he said. "And you'll have to decide whether you want to spend the rest of your life hiding from the possibility of real connection or whether you're ready to risk everything for authentic relationships." That evening, Julianne arrived at the Thornton family dinner with her father's words echoing in her mind and her real identity fully exposed for the first time since moving to Denver. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a simple black dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, jewelry that was clearly expensive but not flashy, an appearance that acknowledged her wealth without flaunting it. Margaret answered the door with a smile of pure vindication, clearly relishing the opportunity to witness Julianne's downfall in front of the entire family. But her expression faltered slightly when she saw how composed Julianne appeared, how she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be someone else. How refreshing to finally meet the real you, Margaret said with sugary malice. I do hope you're prepared to explain to everyone exactly who you've been pretending not to be. I'm prepared to take responsibility for my choices, Julianne replied calmly, stepping into the house where she had spent so many uncomfortable evenings being scrutinized and judged. Preston was already seated at the dining room table, looking like he hadn't slept any better than she had. He avoided her eyes when she entered the room, focusing intently on the water glass he was turning between his hands. His father William looked confused and slightly uncomfortable, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Margaret had invited additional witnesses to the confrontation, Preston's brother Nathan and his wife Sarah, along with the Aunt Victoria who had nearly recognized Julianne months earlier. The dining room felt like a tribunal, with Julianne cast as the defendant about to be sentenced for her crimes of deception. Well, Margaret announced once everyone was seated, I think it's time we all learned some interesting facts about our guest. Julianne, why don't you tell everyone your real last name? The moment stretched uncomfortably as all eyes turned to Julianne. She could feel Preston's tension radiating across the table, could see the confusion on William's face, could sense Margaret's anticipation of her humiliation. My name is Julianne Martinez, she said clearly, addressing the table but looking directly at William. My father is Diego Martinez, and I'm the primary heir to Martinez Holdings. The silence that followed was broken only by Victoria's sharp intake of breath as recognition finally clicked into place. Martinez Holdings, William repeated slowly, his businessman's mind immediately processing the implications. The restaurant conglomerate. The company that's been acquiring properties throughout the Denver metro area. Among other ventures, yes, Julianne confirmed. Nathan leaned back in his chair, whistling softly. Holy shit, that's billions of dollars. Language, Margaret snapped automatically, but her attention was focused on Julianne with laser intensity. Tell them why you've been lying about who you are. Tell them about your elaborate deception. I changed my identity because I wanted to experience life without the complications that come with extreme wealth, Julianne said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Every relationship I'd had before moving to Denver was poisoned by money. People who pretended to care about me but were really interested in my trust fund. I came here to see if I could find something genuine. By lying to everyone you met, Margaret interjected triumphantly. By deceiving my son about the most fundamental aspects of your identity. Yes, Julianne admitted, turning to face Margaret directly. I lied about my background, my family, my financial situation. I created a false identity because I believed it was the only way to have authentic relationships. I was wrong. Preston finally looked up from his water glass, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since she had entered the room. The pain she saw there was worse than his anger had been the night before. Were any of your feelings real? He asked quietly. His voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. Everything I felt for you is real, Julianne replied, pouring all of her sincerity into the words. My love for you, my commitment to our relationship, my vision of our future together. The only lies were about my past, not about my feelings. But how am I supposed to believe that? Preston asked, his voice gaining strength as his frustration grew. How am I supposed to trust anything you say when you've been systematically deceiving me for over a year? You can't, Julianne said simply, the admission hanging in the air like a confession. I've broken your trust in a fundamental way, and I don't know how to repair that damage. I can only tell you the truth now and hope that eventually you'll be able to see past my deception to what was always genuine between us. Margaret was clearly disappointed by Julianne's composure, having expected tears or defensiveness or some dramatic breakdown that would justify her months of hostility. Instead, she was witnessing something closer to a dignified acknowledgement of wrongdoing. This is all very touching, Margaret said acidly, but it doesn't change the fact that you've made fools of all of us. Did you laugh about it? Sitting in your billion-dollar trust fund, watching my son worry about whether he could afford to take you to nice restaurants. For the first time, Julianne's composure cracked slightly. The accusation cut deep because it touched on her greatest fear about her own motivations. I never laughed, she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Every moment of watching Preston's sacrifice for our relationship was painful for me. But I couldn't figure out how to reveal the truth without destroying what we had built together. So instead you chose to let him make a fool of himself, Margaret pressed, sensing weakness. I chose to protect something I valued more than my own comfort, Julianne replied, finding her strength again. I chose to experience genuine love for the first time in my life, even if it meant living with the constant fear of discovery. William, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. Margaret, that's enough, he said firmly. His voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to being contradicted. The girl has admitted her mistakes and taken responsibility for them. Continuing to attack her serves no purpose except cruelty. Cruelty? Margaret's voice rose. She's the one who's been cruel, deceiving our son, making him look like a fool. She's the one who's been trying to find authentic love in a world where money complicates everything, William countered, surprising everyone at the table with his defense of Julianne. I can understand that motivation, even if I disagree with her methods. Preston pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I can't do this, he said, his voice breaking. I can't sit here and debate the ethics of deception while my entire relationship is falling apart. I need time to process this, to figure out what any of it means. He left the dining room without another word, and moments later they heard the front door close behind him. The remaining family members sat in uncomfortable silence, the elaborate dinner cooling untouched on their plates. Well, Margaret said. Finally, her voice brittle with frustrated vindication, I hope you're satisfied with what your little experiment has accomplished. Julianne stood slowly, gathering her purse and the remnants of her dignity. No, she said quietly, I'm not satisfied at all. I've hurt the person I love most in the world, and I have no idea how to make it right. But at least now everyone knows the truth, including me. She walked out of the Thornton house knowing that she might never be welcome there again, that the life she had built in Denver was probably over, and that her experiment in authentic living had instead taught her the devastating cost of deception. But for the first time in 18 months, she was completely honest about who she was, and despite the pain of losing Preston, there was a strange relief in no longer having to maintain the elaborate lie that had defined her existence. The question now was whether honesty had come too late to save anything worth preserving. 3 months passed before Preston called. Julianne had spent those months in a strange liminal space between her old life and her new one, no longer pretending to be someone else but not yet ready to fully embrace being Julianne Martinez again. She had quit her job at Rustic Table, unable to maintain the pretense of needing employment while her true identity was known, but she hadn't returned to Los Angeles either. Instead, she remained in Denver, living in the same small apartment, trying to figure out who she was when she wasn't performing either poverty or privilege. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late summer, when the city was golden with sunset, and the mountains stood sharp against the sky. She had been reading on her balcony, a luxury she had discovered during her months of isolation, when her phone buzzed with his name. Hello, Preston, she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. Hi, he replied, and in that single syllable she could hear months of processing, therapy, and careful consideration. I was wondering if we could talk. In person, I mean. If you're willing. They met at the same park where they had shared their third date, neutral ground that held memories of who they had been before everything became complicated. Preston looked thinner, older somehow, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But when he smiled at her approach, she saw glimpses of the man who had asked her for coffee all those months ago. You look different, he said as they sat on a bench overlooking the lake where families were feeding ducks in the fading light. I stopped pretending to be someone else, Julianne replied simply. It changes you, even when you're not sure who you're supposed to be instead. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching joggers pass by and children chase each other through the grass. The easy peace between them felt like a miracle after months of hurt and confusion. I've been in therapy, Preston said finally. Trying to understand what happened between us, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. What did you decide? Julianne asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. That most of it was real, he said, surprising her. Your feelings, your values, the person you became when you were with me. The only fiction was your history, not your character. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a more complex emotion she couldn't quite name. I also realized something else, Preston continued, turning to face her fully. I was as guilty of deception as you were, just in a different way. Julianne frowned, unsure what he meant. I fell in love with the idea of being your rescuer, he explained, his voice gaining confidence as he worked through thoughts he had clearly been rehearsing. I liked being the successful man who could take care of the struggling waitress. I liked being needed in that specific way. When I found out you didn't need rescuing, didn't need my financial support or protection, I felt like you had stolen something from me. The insight was painful and honest in a way that made Julianne's chest tighten with recognition. But that's not love, Preston said quietly. That's ego. Real love would have been falling for who you were regardless of what you needed from me. And the woman I fell in love with was you, Julianne Martinez, even though I didn't know your real name. Preston, she began, but he held up his hand. Let me finish this, he said with a smile that reminded her why she had fallen so hard for him. I've spent 3 months being angry about the deception, about the lies, about feeling like a fool. But I finally realized that the only thing that actually matters is this: do I want to spend the rest of my life with you, knowing everything I know now? The question hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible distance. And? Julianne whispered. And yes, Preston said simply. I want to build a life with the real you, not the version you thought I needed to see. I want to figure out what our relationship looks like when it's based on complete honesty instead of careful omissions. Julianne felt tears streaming down her cheeks, relief and joy and residual fear combining into an emotional storm that left her speechless. But I need to know that you're done hiding, Preston continued. I need to know that you're ready to be fully yourself, even when it's complicated or uncomfortable. I can't go through this again. I'm done hiding, Julianne said, the words carrying the weight of a vow. These 3 months have taught me that pretending to be someone else, even for good reasons, is exhausting and ultimately destructive. I want to figure out who Julianne Martinez really is when she's not performing for anyone. Preston reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both familiar and completely new. Good, he said. Because I have some ideas about what our life could look like if we're both willing to be completely honest with each other. Over the following weeks, they began the careful work of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of radical transparency. Julianne showed Preston her real apartment, a penthouse in downtown Denver that she had been maintaining throughout her experiment in modest living. She introduced him to her father, who flew in specifically to meet the man who had captured his daughter's heart. She explained the full extent of her wealth, her family's business empire, and the responsibilities that came with her inheritance. Preston, in turn, shared his own insecurities and assumptions, the ways he had constructed their relationship to serve his own emotional needs. He talked about his complicated feelings toward his mother's behavior, his fear of not being successful enough to deserve love, his own struggles with authenticity in a world that often rewarded performance over substance. The conversations were sometimes difficult, occasionally painful, but always honest in a way that their previous relationship had never been. They discovered that they liked each other even better when they weren't pretending to be anything other than exactly who they were. Margaret's reaction to their reconciliation was predictably hostile, but her power to influence the relationship had been broken by the revelation of truth. William, surprisingly, became one of their strongest supporters, admitting privately to Preston that he respected Julianne's courage in choosing love over comfort, even if he disagreed with her methods. 6 months after their reunion, Preston proposed again, this time in Julianne's penthouse overlooking the city where they had both learned the difference between authentic love and performed romance. The ring was different this time, a custom design that reflected not his sacrifice but their shared commitment to building something genuine together. Julianne Martinez, he said, taking her hand in the living room where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Rocky Mountains, will you marry me, knowing that I see exactly who you are and love you not despite your complexity but because of it? Yes, she said without hesitation, understanding that this proposal was fundamentally different from the first one. This time, he was asking to marry all of her, not just the parts she had thought he could handle. Their wedding was a carefully balanced celebration that honored both their backgrounds without compromising either of their values. Diego Martinez walked his daughter down the aisle of a small Denver church, while William Thornton served as Preston's best man. Margaret attended, her disapproval muted but persistent, while Victoria surprised everyone by telling Julianne how much she admired her courage in choosing authenticity over comfort, but the real victory wasn't the wedding itself, it was the life they built afterward. Julianne used her resources to establish a foundation focused on supporting small businesses in underserved communities, work that combined her business acumen with her genuine understanding of what it meant to work for wages. Preston expanded his environmental law practice, funded by his wife's fortune but driven by his own passion for justice. Together, they learned that real partnership meant bringing all of yourself to the relationship, not just the parts you thought were acceptable. They discovered that love could survive radical honesty, that trust could be rebuilt after betrayal, and that authenticity was worth any amount of discomfort. Years later, when people asked Julianne about her unusual path to love, she would tell them that the greatest lesson she learned wasn't about money or deception or family dynamics. It was about the courage required to be fully known by another person, and the extraordinary reward that comes when someone chooses to love all of you, not just the version you think they want to see. The woman who had once hidden billions to find authentic love had discovered something worth more than any fortune, a relationship built on complete truth, mutual respect, and the radical vulnerability that real intimacy requires. She had learned that you can't find genuine connection while wearing a mask, no matter how well-intentioned the disguise. And in the end, that lesson was worth more than all the money in the world. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.